Good morning. The new incense that we're using is like extra smoky, but also it doesn't have that burnt smell to it that the old one has. So more smoke, less burn, everybody's happy. Earlier this week, Father Michael and I discovered this tool on the internet that's based in ChatGPT AI, but it's the Catholic version. And so somebody basically taught the AI, or told the AI rather, to like look at the catechism, and then you ask it questions, and like you said, do I have to go to Mass on Sunday? And it'll give you this really robust answer. Yes, you have to go to Mass on Sunday. Here's why. Here are the times when an exception might be made because of like sickness or, impossibility of getting to Mass. And so we wasted hours and hours and hours, of course, on this thing. Father Michael was asking it all the questions like that, trying to kind of probe it and test its orthodoxy and make sure it was going to give good answers. I spent time trying to pick a fight with it and like asking it all sorts of controversial questions, asking it questions about kind of current events in the church. Even like, at one point it told me that it couldn't answer a question that I had. It didn't know what I was talking about because it's only programmed to know the catechism. And so then I pushed it harder, and it answered. It revealed that it did know what I was talking about. So it's kind of scary that it can do that. But a lot of people probably thought that in the year 2023 we'd be living in Jetsons' houses, up in the sky, and we'd have flying cars or DeLoreans, or Back to the Future predicted that we would wear two ties for some reason. The 80s version of 2020 was more exciting, I think. But anyway, so there's this, kind of fear that people have around AI because, at what point is it going to become Skynet and just know everything and, start thinking on its own and, control us? And it's a scary thing, right? But it's the world in which we live, right? We're called to live here in the world, among the problems of the world, among the difficulties of the world, right? And Jesus in the gospel is giving us this parable of the kingdom, and he's saying the kingdom of God is like a field, right? And here we are living in the kingdom of God in the world, living in this field. God has planted us here as wheat so that we may bear fruit and bear it abundantly. But then while we were asleep, the enemy came. And the enemy came and sowed. Is sowed the past tense? It's not sue? Like throw? What a confusing language we have. I feel bad for people that are trying to learn it as a second language. Anyway, the enemy came and planted weeds, wheat and weeds. The enemy came and planted the weeds, and then as the wheat sprang up, the weeds came with it. And so Jesus gives this example of the kingdom of God being here, and here we are, right, in this nice fertile soil, not in the rocky soil, not in the thorny soil, but in the nice, rich, fertile soil. And we're growing, but there's weeds with us. And the weeds are trying to choke us, and the weeds are trying to strangle us. The weeds, that is, the children of the evil one, the children of the devil, those weeds are there, and they're preventing us from growing as best as we ought, but yet we're still growing, and we can't really do anything about those weeds. So in the parable, it says, should we go out and pull the weeds up so that the wheat can grow more freely? And the owner says, no, because if you do that, you might pull the wheat with it. Elsewhere in the gospel, the apostles are asking Jesus, this situation, should we call down hellfire and brimstone on these people that are unrepentant? No. And so if we think about it, the kingdom of God in which we find ourselves, right, here present on earth, can kind of see it in different ways, right? Jesus says that the field is the world, right? And then there's kind of smaller sections of the field. There's our country, our state, our city, our parish, our family. And God has sown these seeds. That's it. It's sown. That's the, right? Sown. That's the past. Okay. Jesus has sown these good seeds of faith within our parish, within our family. But unfortunately, the enemy has come and sown weeds within our parish, within our family. And maybe we don't want to think about that, right? Because Jesus continues on and he says, yeah, at the end of time, the angels are going to come and they're going to gather the weeds and they're going to bundle them together and they're going to throw them in the fiery furnace where there's going to be wailing and grinding of teeth. And we probably don't want to think about anybody in our family as weeds. I don't know, maybe we do think of people in our family as weeds, but ideally, they're not. We don't want to think about other people here in the parish as weeds, right? We want, what are some of those weeds that can be sown by the enemy, by the evil one in a family or in a parish? Well, parish gossip, I think, that's, people like to gossip. I like to gossip sometimes too. No, I shouldn't. I say I'm sorry, I go to confession. I think the latest gossip going around is that Father Michael and I have become too lazy to turn the pages in the missal. And so that's what people are talking about, that the MCs the Masters of Ceremonies are turning pages because we're lazy. So to those weeds, I call down fire and brimstone. But then there's another way we can kind of look at the gospel that kind of goes against how plants work. But we find ourselves in the field amidst the weeds, and we ought to try to make those weeds more like wheat, right? Conversion. We ought to say, hey, thing that's like choking me and preventing me from being holy, I want you to be holy too, right? To call others to conversion. To go out into the world that's so choked by weeds and by sin and by division and by confusion, to go into the world and say, hey, I'm going to try to introduce some goodness. Well, what am I going to do? I'm just one person, right? Jesus says the kingdom of God's like a mustard seed. It's the smallest seed. And when it grows into this great big tree with lots of branches to provide shade and places for birds to nest. Be like the mustard seed. Or the yeast. He says a woman puts yeast into 3 measures of flour, and measures of flour are like a lot of flour. It would have made enough to feed hundreds of people. Just a small pinch of yeast into that flour. Last night, Art and Sally of Art's Bagels made sure to correct me on my yeast proportions. They told me that to make 1,000 bagels, you have to use like 100 pounds of, no, what it was, I don't know. It was a ton of flour, and then it was like 50 pounds of yeast or something. I don't know. Anyway, I think that the secret ingredient at Art's Bagels that makes them taste so good and makes them taste so authentic is that they ship their water in from New Jersey to mix in with it. But this idea of, just taking this little pinch of yeast and working it, and it takes a while, and you got to, knead it and mash it. It takes a while, but then finally it causes the dough to rise. Finally, it begins to produce this dough that can be baked into something that is useful. And so we're called to be that yeast. We're called to be that mustard seed. We're called to be that just little catalyst that can go out into the world and to implement change that leads others to God. To go out into the world to proclaim the good news. To go out into the world to proclaim the gospel. To go out into the world and not to look around and just say, oh, this is a mess with all these weeds here. Get the weed whacker and take care of it all. But rather to go into the world and to proclaim the gospel. To go into the world and call others to holiness. To go into the world and to be an agent of God. To be an agent of holiness. To be an agent of his will. We can think about all the nastiness and all the wickedness in the world, right? And the church, she's big, but she's not like huge, right? Over 1 billion people in the church, around the whole world, and there's like 7 or 8 billion people in the world. So not huge, but very powerful, right? And the church reaches people in all parts of the world. The church calls people in all parts of the world. And there are saints in all parts of the world. There are people who do the will of God in all parts of the world. And it's all with just this little effort of the mustard seed, of the yeast. All with just this one disciple. Yesterday was the feast day of St. Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene is kind of the apostle to the apostles because she's the one who witnessed first the empty tomb after the resurrection, and she ran and she told the apostles. One woman. And then the apostles, the 12 of them, they go out and they start scattering to the corners of the earth, and they start proclaiming the gospel. And they start sharing it with other people who share it with other people. Imagine if all nearly 500 of us here went out and this week did something to proclaim the gospel in the world. You don't have to go out and stand up on a corner and preach and rant and rave, but in living the gospel, right? Especially within our homes, within our families. Do we live the gospel within our families? I don't know. I'm trying to think back to my childhood, and yeah, sometimes we lived the gospel, but a lot of times we didn't. It's difficult, right? It's hard. But yet Jesus calls us to this greatness of following him. He calls us to holiness. So why does God even allow the weeds? Why does God allow evil? Why do bad things happen to good people? God allows evil because he gave us free will, because he loves us, and so we can choose to reject him. And in choosing to reject him, that is evil. And from our first parents, Adam and Eve, when they chose to reject him, they conditioned us for the rest of our time here on earth, that we too would have that tendency to reject God, that tendency to sin, that tendency to say no thank you, that tendency to desire to do things my own way. And so evil is a result of that. But from evil, God can bring about good, right? It's when the church is persecuted that she flourishes. It's when the church is suffering that she's able to produce saints. Right? We look to the early church, persecuted by the Romans and the Jews. And they produced many saints. They were martyrs, but they were saints. We look to the church around the world where she is persecuted, Africa, Asia, Middle East. In the church there, those suffering is producing saints. I mean, even just look, to the last century, all of the abominations of the last century. St. Maximilian Kolbe is a great example, right? Maximilian Kolbe was sent to Auschwitz. He's a priest, and he volunteered to take the place of a man that they were going to kill, and he ended up giving his life. And it's horrible because especially the circumstances. But from that wickedness, from that nastiness, from that horrific crime against humanity, God brought about saints, martyrs, who show us how to suffer, who show us how to love. And so St. Maximilian Kolbe really is a fantastic example for us, who, within the last 100 years, as an example. Mother Teresa, right? Saint Mother Teresa, a saint that I can remember from my own life. She's that example of that yeast or that mustard seed, just that little bit, to go out into the world and to proclaim the gospel. And she didn't proclaim the gospel by opening the Bible and proclaiming the gospel. She did it through her works, right? She did it through caring for the poorest of the poor. And people condemned her, and people mocked her, and people said she was horrible because she, she didn't have first world standards of cleanliness for taking care of people who were dying. And she called all of us, really, to kind of reflect on the value of life. We have a lot of weeds around us that just kind of say life isn't all that important, right? Whether it be euthanasia or abortion or birth control, just dignity of people in general. We look and we say, nah. And sometimes those weeds, they drag us down. Right? We may have been doing this now for 60, 70, 80 years, and we think, okay, I'm good, I'm wheat, I grew up tall, I'm producing fruit, I can see. I don't want to know anything about those weeds down there, though. Right? I don't want to know anything about them. Don't ask me to do anything about them because I'm up here. But perhaps those weeds have entangled around us. They've grabbed onto our roots so that when the weeds are yanked up, we'll be yanked with them. We don't want to be weeds. We want to be wheat. We don't want to drag down. We want to bear fruit. That was, okay. Was that an Amber Alert or something? Is it bad that I've gone into my phone and turned off all of those? Anyway. Yeah, I can show you how to do that, but you can also be a good Samaritan. But we're called to be that wheat that produces fruit, We're called not to drag down. We're called to be united to God, united to Christ. But there are going to be weeds. And sometimes there's nothing we can do about that. And Jesus says at the end of time they're going to be bundled up and they're going to be thrown into a fiery furnace where there's going to be wailing and gnashing of teeth. And we don't want that to be like our sole impetus for striving to be holy, but yet, when we go to confession in the act of contrition, we say, I fear the loss of heavens and the pains of hell. Right? So that is there, like we're aware of that. But ultimately, we ought to strive to be holy because we love God. We ought to strive to be holy and lead others to holiness because we love God. We ought to strive to live that life of Christian perfection because we love God. And so, are we among the wheat or are we among the weeds? Are we striving to produce fruit or are we striving to drag down? And so it's important for us to recognize in our own lives how it is that we are living in a way so that we may produce fruit, that we're living in a way so that we may lead others to holiness. In my own life, what are the ways in which I don't produce any fruit, where I know that I ought to? In my own life, what are the ways in which I am dragging others down, in which I am leading others away from holiness? And how can I change that? In my life, what are the ways in which I'm preventing others from doing the will of God? And if I continue with that, what will that mean for me? Hopefully all of us can strive to be among the wheat. Hopefully all of us can strive to produce fruit. And so let us continue in this Mass to ask the Lord that He may continue to pour His grace upon us, that we may be able to strive for holiness, that we may be able to live lives in holiness, though we live in the midst of a fallen world, and that we may lead others closer to Him as well.